Okay, hello everyone. We are the Capstone group working with Myriad Mobile. My name is Price Caroline.
Quinn Lass. Jared Farrell.
Jacob Whittingham.
So what is Myriad Mobile, right? This is the first question. It's a mobile company, and they're located in downtown Fargo. They have a split focus between making mobile projects for companies and one kind of big project that's called Bushel. And Bushel is a software platform that connects growers to elevators. Bushel is the side of the company that we're going to be, well, that we have been working with. So Bushel, it lets people, lets farmers or growers connect to elevators from their phones, but in order to do that, they have to integrate with the different softwares that all the different elevators have, because there's not really a standardized way for elevators to keep track of their accounting. And the Bushel platform provides a lot of different information to farmers in the apps, including cash bids, futures, contracts, and scale tickets. So the risk matrix app would be kind of like a utility app as part of the Bushel platform. And right now it exists as an iOS proof of concept app. The app lets you create different scenarios. So the scenarios are based on different variables that the farmers would have. Those variables: yield per acre, cost per acre, price, and basis. Basis, if you don't know, is like the local, it's kind of like a local tax. So when you're selling your crops based on the transportation costs, it's going to be a slightly different price from the national price. So that basis tells you how to make that calculation. So you can put all those variables into the risk matrix app, and it'll display a matrix like the one you see here, and it'll tell you, based on different combinations of the yield and the cost, since those variables are harder to predict, it'll tell you whether you make a profit or not. So the need, well, like I said, the risk matrix app right now is just on iOS. So in the short term, the idea is to convert it to an Android app, which is what we started doing. But in the short term, it's just going to be a proof of concept. The long-term plans, not fully hashed out, but one idea is to integrate it into the Bushel platform. So it could be a standalone utility app like it is right now, or it could be added on to the existing Bushel apps as kind of like a side feature. But either way, when we're developing it, we need to plan for those future outcomes. So we want to make sure that they can adapt it to their development process, because we're not going to continue developing it when we're done with Capstone. So if Myriad wants to keep developing it, they're going to have to change, they're going to have to make it fit their workflow. And there's also a service that they use to get price data. So we want to make sure that we're developing it in a way that makes it easy to connect to that service. So how are we doing those? How are we accomplishing those goals? Of course, the first thing to do is just convert the existing app to Android as close as reasonably possible. And when I say reasonably possible, what I mean, it's not going to be, they're not going to have the exact same screenshots. They're not going to be exactly the same. They're going to have all the same features and all the same basic inputs and basic screens, but the buttons are going to be moved around a little bit, obviously. There's different kind of standard best practices for Android and iOS, so it's not going to look exactly the same. And how do we accomplish the long-term goals? So in order to help make it as easy as possible to integrate the app into the Bushel platform, we want to code it well. And the more cleanly we code it, the easier it'll be to read and to maintain. And then the other thing we did for the price service, we made it so that since the price service returns JSON data, there's existing code that it can interpret the JSON, and it actually uses that right now. But we'll talk about that more later. Okay, so what value does our solution have for customers? Well, all the value that the existing iOS app would have for customers, it now brings that value to Android customers as well. So that's kind of the obvious one. But what is that value? It helps growers make business decisions. So when you're farming, deciding what you want to grow is difficult because there's a lot of unpredictable variables. And this chart shows you some of the examples. You probably can't read it, but these are a bunch of different reasons that farmers would have difficulty choosing what to grow. So you can see the biggest one. They want to save money on the inputs, so they want to reduce the cost as much as possible. And then there's a lot of them that are about analyzing the performance of the previous years, which the app doesn't really help with that, but it's just one of the many factors that farmers have to consider. So the app, the whole idea of the risk matrix is that the matrix shows you the variables that are harder to predict. You can just input the predictable ones, and then you'll be able to see the different possible outcomes from different combinations of the unpredictable ones. And you can make different scenarios. So the scenarios will be you have different crops or different costs and things like that, and you can see what the different outcomes will be based on those scenarios that you create.
All right, that's a little cut off, but this is our user story so far. As you can see, you got red, yellow. The yellow means this is what we're working on currently, this sprint. The green is what we have done so far, and the red is what we have yet to do. So far we've focused on, being able to start a scenario and being able to edit it. We haven't been working on the big thing, the risk matrix so far. That'll be coming up in the next 2 sprints. And so far we're able to select data for the scenario and edit it as well. And also, I believe we're able to select 1 of 5 crops so far. You can all see that in the demo that we have. So our schedule so far, the first sprint was spent getting familiar with the Android development kit. It is new to us, well, new to some of us, and getting the repository set up as well. The second sprint was actually working on the project, getting the UI ready, and as well as getting ready for the risk matrix for the next coming weeks. And Sprint 3, we'll be working on that risk matrix as well as getting a database ready. And for the next sprint, finishing up postmortem as well, we'll be completing the risk matrix as well. And having any stretch goals, we'll complete those if we have any more time.
As far as progress goes, this is kind of the progress of the initial page that we have. It kind of just starts the user out, opening up the app, showing bushel scenarios. It's pretty much going to prompt the user to create a scenario if they haven't already done so. When a scenario is created, the text shown that welcome to bushel scenarios will be replaced with all the data that represents a scenario that has been created. The button at the top to create a scenario launches you a new activity to start actually building a new scenario. And like Quinn talked about, this is pretty similar to the look and feel of the iOS app, just with some different little minor details.
This is some of the progress that we've gotten done on the scenario creation UI. This is the screen where you can first select your crop that you want, and then from that crop you get the delivery dates that we pull in from all the JSON data. We set this up so it can just be dynamically filled in by whatever JSON file that we're given, and we also built it for the future if we want to put or hook it up to an API and just pull it in from that. Kotlin itself is pretty easy with JSON interpretation, so it's just hooking up crop model classes and data classes and just converting all that JSON to Kotlin classes. So apart from that, it was pretty easy to set up.
And then after you choose your crop and your delivery date, it'll take you to a form that actually wants you to input the data relevant to the previous information that you got. So the information from the crop selection is going to, be transferred over into this one to be used into the next step to complete the risk matrix. So you choose corn and you choose a delivery date of whatever the response from the API is or the JSON file. And then you give it, an applicable name so that you can, if you had multiple harvests, you can, try to differentiate between just naming them the same thing so you know what your scenario is. You put in your acres, your bushels, you can put in bushels per acre, total costs, and then the basis, like we talked about, difference between futures price and local cash price, so it's kind of like a tax. So yeah, this is really just used for the people using the app to just put in the relevant, unique data about their harvest.
Okay, yeah, so now I'm going to tell you where the progress is at right now for the saving of the scenarios to the device. I'm just going to go back for a second. You can see here all the different variables that they input that we have to save. So those all get saved to the phone so that when you open it up later, all your scenarios are still there. And I had to decide whether I was going to implement it with the SQLite database that's built into Android phones or the shared preferences option. And shared preferences is really easy to use. It just saves key value pairs. But it's not ideal for storing structured data or storing a lot of data. So like you don't know how many scenarios you're going to have. So it's awkward to use key value pairs to save a dynamic number of pairs really. So it would maybe have been easier to use shared preferences, but probably not. And it's not really a good choice for storing structured data. And it's also not that good of a choice for the long-term goals, which are making the app maintainable. So overall, I thought the SQLite database was a pretty clear decision. And to use that, you need to have a database helper set up. So that just defines the structure of what the tables are going to look like. And it lets you do CRUD, creating, reading, updating, deleting. So the methods for that are implemented. And right now they use a test table structure, so it doesn't have all the variables that you saw on the previous slide. I just need to change those out. That's a quick process. And yeah, there's just a simple data class to store the scenario values when you pull them out of the database so that the app can use them. That's really easy to make with Kotlin. And we'll talk later about why we chose Kotlin over Java, but you can see this line here is the full code for the data class. It's just one line. Really easy.
So now we're going to show a little demo of the app we have here. So we're launching this on just an emulator. Obviously works the same as using a physical device, but it's a lot easier to present here. So this is the first form we were talking about, just prompting the user to create a scenario. It'd also be the one that would be showing the scenarios that were created. So that's where they would show up here if you had one. So press this button to start creating your first scenario. Choose the crop, and like we talked about, so far we've only integrated the one crop into it because that's kind of what our sponsors have defined as the goal initially to get us going. So you choose crop, and then based on the information that you would get from the API or the JSON file, it pulls the applicable delivery dates. So if you were to choose like wheat or soybeans, they're not everything's going to be delivered on May 31st. It could be February 28th or whatever other date. So it takes that data from which crop you choose. Go to the next form. Give it your name of your scenario. Type in however many acres you were harvesting with at your farm, number of bushels, and then it'll autofill the bushels per acre, so that it kind of gives you more information of like what your actual bushels per acre is without having to do it externally. Same idea with total costs. Just put in what your total costs were for harvesting this like for creating this harvest. Should calculate your cost per acre, and then the local basis, like we talked about, is just you input well, so far we have it set up so that you would input what your local basis is, but this could be set up to take the data from the previous screen of selecting the crop and putting that in to autofill your local basis based on what the response was for that. So, and then going back to the top is where you'd have the save, which would take you to the next thing, which is really making the risk matrix and saving that scenario back to the original screen if you want to go back and change anything else. So that's pretty much what we have so far for that. So the environment that we've been using to do all this, we've been writing it all in Kotlin because that is what Myriad Mobile uses to develop all their new Android apps. It's kind of taken over Java in the Android world, and it's officially, used by Google. So we decided to use Kotlin over Java, developing an Android Studio. We're running the application on an emulator. We're using GitHub for a repository for version control, and we do have access to the iOS source code on Bitbucket so that we can look at the existing iOS proof of concept app.
Right, so some issues and risks that we've come up by would be mostly the Java versus Kotlin discussion. We picked Kotlin because it is becoming more in fashion, other than Java, which is kind of going outwards. Setting up meeting times, we all have busy schedules that conflict with each other, so it's hard to meet up and talk as a team other than meeting in class or meeting with our sponsor. So it's kind of hard to give tasks during the week. Some weather prevented our meetings. That was earlier in the semester. And the iOS code that our sponsor gave us was only usable with Macs, and only some of us have Macs, so that was an issue that was a risk that really didn't pan out to an issue. So that was fine. We had some problems setting up with GitHub, but that was resolved, I believe. And again, dividing up work is still a problem for us. Still meeting up and discussing the task for the week. Also, this is kind of a linear project, we believe, so you can't do something before you complete something else, so you can't finish one part without finishing the other one.
Yeah, that last point really just means that since the workflow is just so straightforward that it's kind of hard to preempt some of the other work, because you really can't do a whole lot to preempt something that needs to be done for the next step of the project or the next form to be completed.
Okay, yeah, so this is our analysis. These are the user stories that we completed for the sprints that have occurred so far. So in sprint 1, we implemented adding scenarios and selecting different crops and selecting the delivery date process, which you saw in the demo. And sprint 2, we worked on basically allowing different people to use the app. That's kind of like not something code-wise, just, yeah, these stories are kind of like, should they really be 5s? Like, we didn't physically do anything to implement these stories, but they're implemented just by the fact that there's no reason that an elevator employee or a third-party employee wouldn't be able to use the app the same way that a farmer would. So, yeah, those were implemented. And yeah, backwards navigation. So when you're in the middle of creating your scenario and you input a bunch of variables, you realize maybe you selected the wrong thing earlier, you want to be able to go back and change that. So we implemented that as well. And if you look at the totals, we got 7 story points done here, 14 done here. So our average velocity then would be 10.5.
For a reflection, looking back at it, we all have a really good work ethic. We're always trying to get stuff done, and we're really working together as a team when we can. But looking, what we can improve on is communication. Like sometimes we'll just all start doing one thing when you really should be all focusing on one thing. You got to divvy up our tasks a little better. Then our documentation also is a little bit of an issue. We just got to continue to put in more hours into that and just keep up to date with it instead of just putting it off.
So the next steps, what we're going to take, adding better validation to the data entry form, making sure users aren't, with user input, you really need to have good validation. You don't want, you don't want the risk matrix to be showing or breaking or having a problem, so we need to have good validation for that. Finish saving the scenario after the data input. It's kind of in place, but not fully there yet. And then display that saved scenario on the starting form. And then having the ability to show multiple saved scenarios on that initial form. Finishing the scenario saving, like I was talking about. Finish, fully implementing the database, connecting the database to the UI so that we can do all of the changes that we need to. And then begin working on the real, pinnacle piece, the risk matrix, so that we can, do everything from creating the form, or create all the forms, get all the data, and then create the matrix, shade it red, yellow, green, so that we know what the profit margins are, edit the range sliders, and then the stretch goals would be making, the pixel shading on the risk matrix like a nice gradient that we saw in the initial picture, as opposed to just like each cell being red, yellow, or green or whatever, and then adding the actual API integration instead of just the one JSON file that we've been using.
All right, do we have any questions?
Did you guys ever consider cross-platform, Xamarin kind of applications? One.
We didn't really consider that, mainly because it was already created in iOS. And the way that the Myriad team is structured, they have an Android team and an iOS team, but not a cross-platform team. So it made sense to do two separate apps.
I'm sorry, I was too busy yelling. And just curious, because I don't really have an idea of what the risk analysis looks like and what the form, I mean, you showed me a beautiful screen. I love how it works. Is the farmer going to have the capacity to, like, say, wheat, rye, corn? And then if I devote 10, or not 10, but hundreds of acres to one, hundreds of acres, because we talked about how they could do multiple, right? Multiple items. After they have done that to their satisfaction, are they able to save the one cross purpose as one?
No.
So it's just individual. It stays individual.
Yeah, each scenario is
Okay.
individual. The issue with that, if we wanted to have a bunch of different crops in the same,
Mm-hmm.
the same
That makes sense.
display, there would be too many variables. Like you can
Mhm.
only get a nice looking display if you have two variables.
Yeah,
So.
true. Okay, thank you.
Is there a framework to build some automated tests for this? Is that something that's part of the scope?
It's not really part of the scope of our contribution to the project. Like, there's not test cases for the existing iOS thing either, really. Could you do that? Yeah, definitely. There's definitely different ways to do that.
I think